It's always been about money. That's what Dr. Andy Johnson, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota Mankato, said about reading. Thank you all for joining. I'm already having people join. Mendez, Marvin, Francis, and Lucifer, one name. Thank you for joining. So I'm talking today about reading and reading's effects on the history of reading and kind of how we got to where we're at. And this is the first time I've tried to do a long live. I've done some little ones, so I appreciate you coming. I really do. And I'm going to just talk about reading and power. And so I'm entitling this Power, Money, and the Mind because that's kind of the background of reading in this country and what we're seeing. And it has to do with the history of the United States and the history of reading. So, thank you for joining Flossie Mental Hustle Mindset. Thank you for joining Hernandez. My eyes are the best. Afanel the Barbie 7, thank you. Louis Arangel 22, thank you. SN95 Rico, thank you. Thank you all for joining. This is actually a really good turnout. My daughter's in the bed sleeping, and I may have to get her. I have an almost 2-year-old. But I'm going to try to get through this today and just tell a little bit about reading, our current reading policy, and also the reading crisis, which is something that a lot of people are interested in. I don't think the news has done a very good job explaining that. I have a PhD in reading. I've taught in 15 different schools. That sounds really impressive. Most of the time that was as a traveling teacher. So I would go to many schools. I was an English as a second language teacher for a long time. And so I'm going to talk about reading and our history and just kind of how we got here and the things that are causing it. So I'm going to kind of do a deep dive of that, where we are in the United States in reading. So let's start with where we're at. Thank you, Planet Lover, Glove Animal. Thank you for joining. So I have this chart, and I apologize that's hard to see. I wasn't able to really get the camera the way I wanted it. But this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. And there's only really 2 measurements that show how the United States is doing. Thank you for those of you who liked or sent gifts. I appreciate that. But there's only really 2 measurements that show how the United States as a whole is doing because every state has a different test and they're all a little bit different. So the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is the test that shows how we're doing in the United States. They also call it the Nation's Report Card, and this is just this is an overview. If you're really interested in this, you can go in the NAEP Data Explorer. You can just Google that, and you can get breakdowns of states, subgroups, different years. You can get all kinds of things. Thank you for joining, Fun. Oh, thank you. Someone lit up my goal, which I don't really know what that means, but thank you for that. So, in the headlines, it is that we're doing better than we did during COVID, and we were rebounding from COVID. The headline actually for NAEP was that we're doing better than we ever had than COVID, and it makes it just sound really, really positive. But it's really not that positive. So what happened was NAEP was given at age 9 and thank you for all the likes, and at age 13. So most of the time those are kids in 4th grade and 8th grade. But they do it based on age, and it's not every kid in the school. It's just a sample. And we've been giving this test since 1974. And basically, what it found this year, or last year, it was given in 2025, was that there was an increase in the score for age 9, but not for age 13, and for reading. And I think there's a similar thing with math. And yeah, share your live if you want to invite more friends. I'm also probably going to put this on my videos. I'm going to share the recording, so please follow me if you want to see this later. But anyway, and I thank you all for joining. This is a very good turnout. I really appreciate it. This is the first time I've done a long live, and I'm also a little bit unsure myself. So I thank you for being here and being patient with me. But anyway, what it found was last year it was not statistically significant. So what does that mean? So there was only 4 points difference between 2020 COVID year and 2025. There was an extra test in there, so that the dates are off. It's usually every 2 years, but there was that extra test because of COVID. They wanted an extra test. So anyway, what they found was that there was a very small difference, a small gain between 20 and 2025. And it wasn't big enough to say that it meant anything, honestly. It could have just been the way the test was written or the way the kids that they sampled were a little different. Like, you can't take that and say that the kids are doing better because it's too small a difference. However, there was a statistically significant difference. In other words, it was big enough to say this is probably a gain. Kids are probably doing better among our lowest readers, the kids who are struggling the most. And I'm going to get into that when I talk about the science of reading at the very end of this, if I can get through all of it today. It's a lot. I may break it into two depending on questions and things like that. But when we talk about the science of reading or structured reading, that's very, very decoding heavy. In other words, it teaches phonics, patterns of words. And those are the kids who are most likely to benefit from that. Our very lowest readers are the ones who can't sound out words, who have trouble looking at words and knowing what they actually say. Some struggling readers also struggle with comprehension. That means understanding text. We've got vocabulary. That's a huge thing among English learners. Many English learners obviously don't have, very big vocabulary, and that causes an issue. We're having a huge fluency problem, which is what my course is about, which it means that kids are no longer able to read large text, and there's a reason for that too, and I'll talk about that. But for those kids who struggle with decoding, that tend to be the lowest kids, they're doing better, and that is something to celebrate because they were the ones who were doing worse from 2012 on, which is where there was this big drop. What we were seeing was that those particular students were dropping the most. So that's very good news for those kids. Get Good Libro, thank you for joining. Blue, thank you for joining. So if you look at the NAEP score overall, and again, I apologize that this is hard to see, and you can go on the NAEP site and find it more detailed. Like I said, you can explore all kinds of things. This is just a very rough draft. The first tape test was in 1974, and the last one was 2025. It was released in 2026. But this is what it looked like, kind of. Thank you for joining, Lena. So in 1974, scores were lower. They went up and they went up all the way till about 2012, and then it went down in 2026. So this is interesting because a lot of people say that schools were a lot better before 1979, before the Department of Education, and this doesn't show that at all. It shows that schools actually got better, a lot better. The other score that we can look at is called the PISA test. Hi, Dino. And that was done, I think the latest test was in 2024. That is a global test. They test students all over the world. And that wasn't even until 2000. So again, those people who say, well, schools got really bad after 1979, there's not evidence to support that. We don't have evidence as far as comparing to other countries. It's possible that, other countries got a lot better than us. That's possible because there were a lot of education reforms. But as far as American education, schools have gotten better. However, and they're still better now than they were in 1974. Even with the dip, there was a dip in about 2012. I'm going to talk about that. And there was another one during COVID. Basically, it's been flat since then. There's just been slight change. But we're still better than we were in 1974. Hi, Levy. So again, I apologize at how rough this is. I know this is really hard to see, and I apologize. But I'm going to walk you through it. So again, if you're really interested in this, you can go on the NAEP site, the Data Explorer, and they will have much better charts, much more in-depth charts. But what we see here is that students who traditionally have been struggling in education, who have had a harder time because of economics and because of racism and language difference and all these things. Um, but basically, the three big groups are low income students. We call that socioeconomic status, students who tend to have less economic resources and maybe in poverty. Hispanic and black students, that has shot up much bigger. Hi, Levi. Thank you for joining. That has shot up, and the curve was much steeper. So those students improved the most during this time. Most of the growth was with those groups. And you see, I did a chart here of higher socioeconomic status in white students. There was still an increase, but it was very small and gradual. So most of the increase that we saw during this time was for these marginalized groups. And I believe that this was because there was a lot of federal money put in to help those groups and a lot of accountability. I think it's probably more the federal funding when you think about the programs. There's Title I for low-income students, that brought in a lot of money, a lot of extra resources, a lot of extra teachers. Then there's Title III, which is for English learners, huge program, and unfortunately, I think it's probably going to go away, which hurts my heart because I was English as a second language teacher. There is students with disabilities, even though there has been an increase with them, it hasn't been as big, but there was funding for that. So there's all these different things that have brought money and brought resources to these students. And there's also been a huge move for equity back especially in the 80s and the 90s. Schools were actually redistricted. Back in 1974, schools were just starting to integrate. In other words, black students and Hispanic students were starting to go to school with white students, especially in the South. So until about the 1990s, the early 2000s, there was a big jump with that, which again is something to celebrate, but that jump has kind of gone away. And in some ways, schools are more segregated now than ever. But those students are still doing better than in 1974, but it's unfortunate that trend did not continue. So, I've divided our history of education into different categories. So our early years, in other words, at the beginning of the United States history, there were really low levels of advanced education. Most people just went to school from kindergarten. If you were for first grade, you didn't have kindergarten then. So about age 6, if you were lucky, you would go to maybe age 13. Most people stopped around age 13 or 14 because they had to work. And if you were really from a prominent family, maybe you would be able to have an education past that. But you were really privileged if you had any kind of higher education, even a high school education. Because people had to work, and they had to work, they had to, schools were usually in rural places, were really far away, so something happened, you had to walk to school every day, and something happened, and the weather was bad, you couldn't go. Hi, Keisha. People got sick a lot, and they had to stay home either because they were sick or because their children were sick, and people pretended to marry early. So at the very beginning of this country, education was really a privilege. The wealthy were taught at home, particularly in New England, or they had like a governess, somebody to teach them, or maybe they went to a small school. But it wasn't really until the late 1800s that most people could access ongoing education. School, again, was something that you did when you were able to, and it was highly valued. But most people had very little education. If you got the basics of reading and writing, you were more educated than most people. And the thing is, at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of literacy needed. If you had the basics of reading, writing, math, you were able to do most things. And you actually had an edge on a lot of people. And particularly black people before the Civil War couldn't read and write at all. So again, that's a privilege to read and write. It actually gets the law to read and write. I have a video about that if you're interested on my channel. Hi, Yeselin. Hope I said your name right, and Akla. I have something on the channel, but literacy and math were highly valued, but they weren't things that most people could access. Again, though, it didn't really matter as much, and it really didn't matter that much until about the 1950s. In the 1950s, until about the 1950s, you needed basic skills. It wasn't like in the 1800s where if you couldn't read or do math, you were set up for life. That wasn't true. You needed to have reading and you needed to have basic math, but you didn't need to have a huge level of that. And if you were able to access higher education, you were just doing really well. You were doing better than most people. Most jobs, most well-paying jobs, didn't require like a college degree. If you read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, that takes place, I believe, in the 1920s, the main character goes to work at a publishing house, and there are readers, which are like editors. They read the books and the magazines, and they comment on them, and they find the grammatical mistakes and everything. And only one of the readers there in New York City, which is one of the most educated places in the world at that time, had been to college. So you just didn't need a college degree for a lot of jobs. I think about my grandparents. My grandmother was a very smart woman, my paternal grandmother, but she did not go to college, and she was an executive secretary for the Women's Air Force. Okay, try increasing your, I'm going to optimize this because it's giving me a volume adjusted. Okay, can you hear me better? Can you hear me? Let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, so anyway, she was an executive secretary for the Women's Air Corps, which was a huge, huge job. And she had a high school diploma. My paternal grandfather went to teacher's school and taught math for a while. And then during the war, he was a surveyor for the U.S. government. Very high-paying job, very good job with benefits. But he had a 2-year teaching degree. It wasn't even anything that had to do with engineering or measurement. Basically what that meant was making maps, and he had no background with that, yet he had a really, really big job, and it was a big job. So until about the 1950s, they just needed basic skills, and that's kind of what the country was founded on when it came to developing public schools, which really didn't happen until the late 1800s in most places. And I want to talk a little bit about phonics because there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to phonics. Phonics is the alphabet system. So, for example, A says A, B says B. That's a simple view of it. There's all kinds of letter combinations, but there's been a huge, huge push of phonics lately. I'm going to talk about that later. It's very controversial, believe it or not. But they had phonics until the late 1800s, and they took it away because they actually thought that not having phonics would make it more equitable. In other words, that people would be able to memorize words better and more people would be able to read that way. There's also this idea that phonics is boring. And again, you're trying to open up education for people, and they wouldn't be motivated by phonics. So they didn't really have that again until later, until the 1970s. And I'm going to go into that. But people say, oh, well, my great-grandmother studied phonics. That's why she was really good at reading. Probably not. More than likely she didn't. Because from the late 1800s till about the late 1970s, phonics wasn't taught. So that's interesting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But in 1954, there was Brown versus Board of Ed. Up until that time, black students, white students, and then in some places Native American students, Asian students, and Latino students all attended different schools. In some places, particularly in the South, but West had schools that were segregated for Latinos. Anyway, 1954, Board versus Brown Board of Ed said that everybody had to go to school together, basically. But it took 15 to 20 years for that to really happen. My mother, her high school was integrated she's in South Carolina, upstate, and her high school, I believe, was integrated in 1972, and she was a sophomore in high school. So it took a very long time for that to happen, and we still have the history of that. Just a lot of things happened during that time period. Many really good black teachers lost their jobs, unfortunately, because of integration. Just a lot of things happened. And here in the South, particularly in South Carolina, there's one right down the road, actually, and Alabama and Mississippi, there were the segregation academies that were formed. And it was really the first voucher program because for a while the government formed them. Virginia actually started them, I believe. And the government, they were these small private schools that only took white children, and for a while the government funded that. The courts ruled you couldn't do that in the 1960s, but there are still these segregation academies that they charge very little money. They're very small, and they only take white students. And like I said, there's one right down the road here, and it does take black students at this point, but it's still got very little diversity. And it's kind of known in this community that a lot of white students prefer that. The community I'm in, there's actually a good amount of diversity in the public schools, but you go an hour away. I'm not co-hosting right now. Okay, I'm just not. Sorry, I'm not ready for that. But thank you. Maybe at some point I'll be ready. I doubt it'll be the day. But anyway, there's these segregation academies where just white kids go. And so like an hour away from here, there are whole schools that are still segregated. Like in the high school, they have maybe a handful of white students, and they're all black students because the white students go to a school down the road. And there's a lot of giving to help white students who can't afford it. There's just a lot going on. Anyway, that still exists. They're called segregation academies. And many of them have been closed, or they, now they have a lot of diversity. Some of the ones in Virginia have really a lot of diversity now. Some of the bigger ones. So that was part of it, was this whole idea of segregation. So then in the 1960s, we have testing legislation. We've had IQ tests before then, not very accurate, and they were basically used to kind of put students on track. So to say who was going to college, who was probably not going to college, who was going to maybe vocational school or a trade school, and who was going right to the workforce. They weren't really used in a way to judge teachers, or even to really judge students in a way that would be harsh towards the students. There wasn't punishment involved. The teachers had so many students who didn't do well on the test. But in the 1960s, they started to have standardized tests, but it really wasn't a big deal. So my grandmother worked in upstate South Carolina as a teacher for over 30 years. She was also a guidance counselor librarian, pretty well known in the queer community because she's a character. But she told me she was teaching elementary school when they had the first standardized test. The kids just took the test. It was a pencil and paper test then. She took them up, she put them in a folder, she sent them somewhere, probably to Columbia, the state capital, for somebody to look at them. They never even heard the results. It wasn't a big deal, it was just something that you did. Which, of course, today, the results are all over. They're in the newspaper, they're online, schools have report cards. That all started with No Child Left Behind, which I'll talk about in a moment. But gradually, tests became more of a big deal. And then No Child Left Behind really made it a huge deal. And in 1974, we have our first NAEP test. And in 1979, we have the Department of Education formed. And again, that was when they started to have a lot of money put in for education. Almost forgot IDEA, which is huge. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that's 1975. And before then, students with disabilities were not guaranteed an education. So schools could say, we just don't have the resources for you. You can't go to school. Or they could say, well, you can come to school, but we're not going to accommodate you. So if a student was in a wheelchair, the school could say, well, that's tough. We don't have an elevator. You have to just take the classes that you can take, that you can get to, or you just won't come here. Students with intellectual disability, students who have things like Down syndrome or something like that, where it's harder for them to learn. They oftentimes didn't go to school at all if it was a severe disability, like a child who couldn't talk or walk or something like that. Those kids would always be at home. The others might go to school for a few years, but if it didn't work out, they just didn't go to school. Another thing that happened with IDEA that was really controversial, and when I say this, people say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that was controversial. But it's still in the reading field is kind of controversial, is that they came up with a category of learning disabilities. Before then, students who just had a harder time learning content but had normal intelligence, they weren't seen as having a disability. They just were thought, well, they just have to learn a little bit different, or it takes them a little bit longer, and maybe they aren't going to college or something. But the whole idea of learning disabilities wasn't really a thing until 1975 with IDEA, and it barely got in there. It almost didn't get in there. And that's the biggest category now for IDEA. And when I tell people that, they're just shocked because there's so many kids who have learning disabilities. That's the biggest category. And I'll get to that in a minute and how that's affected, particularly reading education. late 1970s, early 1980s, there were a handful of cases that established that English learners needed extra support. It wasn't enough for students to just be in the classes with the other students. If you speak a language other than English at home and you don't know English fluently, you need extra support for that. So that started the whole ELL program. And that was court cases, so it was never legislated in law. So that's one of the reasons why now students with disabilities are kind of in trouble under this administration because they're changing some things. But I'm actually more concerned about English learners because, again, this was never put into law. There was never really legislation about it. It was just court cases, and court cases can be challenged. So I think it's quite likely, and other people who are in the field think it's quite likely that within the next maybe 5 years, depending on what happens politically, English language programs will either be cut back really a lot, or they may just be removed entirely if the courts rule that they can be, which would be really detrimental because over 10% of students speak a language other than English at home, and many of those students need support to do well at school. If they get that support, especially in the early years, students who speak a language other than English at home will actually do better than their peers. People don't understand that. They think that it's a disadvantage to know two languages because, of course, one language. They think that one language will hurt the other language, but it's actually the opposite. Students who who are bilingual, who speak a language other than English at home, and master the English language through, and sometimes they need special instruction, but they master it. By the time they get into middle school, they're doing better than their English-only peers. It's a huge, huge advantage to the mind to be bilingual and to know two languages and to have that background of how language works. Okay, MAPS, thank you for joining me. So yeah, that's what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. The big thing about school accountability, and thank you for all of you who are still here. I'm trying to make this as interesting as I can. And if anybody has questions, and you may have questions later, please type in the questions. I'm looking at that. I know that this is some people would say this is boring, but it's actually kind of interesting if you're interested in education and why we're at where we're at today. And I don't feel like the story's really been told all the way through. I feel like the media and popular opinion has some stories that a little bit has been told, but the whole story hasn't been told. And there's a lot of different factors that go into why we're at today. It's not just one thing. People are trying to blame not teaching phonics, for example, as being the problem why kids can't read. And that's just one of the things that causes this problem. And it's not, in my opinion, it's not the primary thing. Anyway, so in 1983, we have a report that most people have forgotten about. I didn't know about till grad school. It's called A Nation at Risk. And it was a series of hearings. And they had all this data about how the United States was doing worse than other countries. But I couldn't find any support for that. I couldn't find research papers that showed that. Again, we didn't have PISA till 2000. We didn't have anything that showed us how we were doing compared to other countries until 2000. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, the United States would be really high up in the PISA list if it wasn't for poverty. We would be in the top 10. We wouldn't be number 1 in reading, but we would probably be in the top 10. They found a few years ago, once they took all the students in poverty out of the PISA test, they found that I believe we'd be number 7 in the world, which we still could do better, and we should do better. But that's a huge jump. 7 in reading, I believe it was the 14 in math, if you were to take all the students in poverty out. So again, in this country, we have all these factors that affect education that we've worked hard to try to close that gap, but again, since the 1990s, that gap has remained and in some ways gotten bigger, and I'm afraid it's going to get bigger. Taz, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. I'm afraid it is going to get bigger because of some things going on with policy. But anyway, 1983, A Nation at Risk. This report, which again didn't cite any papers, it had a list of all these experts they talked to with the hearings, and but they didn't have any like scholarly reports attached to it, which is very strange. Usually, when you have a report, you have sources with it. I know that was before things were digitized, but still there should have been some kind of article chapters or published work that they drew on, and they didn't draw on anything. It was just, again, all these people talking, and it was a huge list. You can read it. It's on ERIC. It's free. You can read the report. It's not very long. I think it's 60 pages. And at the end, they just have this list of people that were in the hearing. I'm not going to co-host right now. Maybe later. I'm sorry. I'm getting used to this. I probably won't do it today. Maybe next week I will. I'm just not doing it today. Sorry. I'm not ready for that. So 1983, there was a nation at risk. And again, it said that the U.S. was doing awful, particularly compared to Russia. That was the big concern, was that Russia at that time was our enemy for the Cold War. And there was this idea that Russia was doing so much better that in the future they would have all this technology that would take off and all this scientific knowledge, and the United States were not. So that's kind of where the whole focus on STEM began. And it's, again, just like everything else, it's kind of taken on a new meaning now. It's become huge in the last 10 to 15 years. Science, technology, education, science, technology, engineering, and math. And now they've added art in some places, so it's STEAM. I think the art just is kind of make it more fun. But anyway, there's this focus on science and math that's huge, and most of the federal money that you have, like grants for, special grants, it's in science and math. It's not in reading and math. Particularly like research grants, like universities that are doing special programs. It's very hard to do a reading program or a math program. It's very easy to get the money for science. And that's when all this started. And again, PISA in 2000 led to a lot of competitiveness because the United States did not do super well. We were in the top 25% in both reading and math, but barely. We're in the 40s and the 50s. And the most recent PISA, we actually went up in the rankings, even though our scores stay flat, because other countries are struggling even more since 2012 than we are, which is very interesting. In 2012 and then later in 2020 with COVID, there are countries who are way, way down. And we went down, but not as much as they did. So in some ways our rankings are actually up. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but people don't realize that that this decline in both reading and math scores is global. It's very global. So people teach different all over the world. So it can't just be our teaching style. There have to be other things going on. And I'm going to talk about that. I think the things are to help to overcome the other things going on, but you can't just blame the way things are taught, which is, people are blaming phonics, they're blaming parents sometimes. Parents are different all over the world. Values are different all over the world. So there's other factors also. Baby Girl and Rokenho, nice to meet you. So yeah, there was this focus on reducing the achievement gap. The tests were expanded. I remember in the 1990s, I remember taking the first end of course test in North Carolina. Before that, there was the CAT test out of California, and I think one year I took the Iowa test. They borrowed other people's tests, and the tests were pretty generic. And they were they were just fill in the blank, or you would bubble at that time. You would fill in bubbles. They weren't on a computer because computers weren't huge then. And then in the mid-1990s, I remember being in, I believe it was the 5th grade, so that would have been 1993. I remember taking the first social studies end of course test, and it actually had written questions that you were supposed to write like half a page to a page each. So much, much more complicated. And in some ways, I feel like those tests are more complicated than the tests today. I'm pretty sure they are in some ways, even though most tests do have writing today. Because the tests have adapted to the kids. And I can talk about that a little later. If anyone has any questions about that, just put them in the chat. But tests got really hard, and now they're starting to get easier just because we need for the tests to look good, unfortunately. That part of it is true. People who say that education's been dumbed down, the tests have been dumbed down. I'm not sure education as a whole has been dumbed down. In some ways it has, and in some ways it hasn't. Until about the 1990s, rigor was going up. In Tennessee, it went up pretty big in the 2010s because of something called Race to the Top. They actually redid their standards. They started teaching, really focusing on education and challenging students, and it was a huge thing. But I think Tennessee was unique, very unique in that. And in a lot of places, and even within Tennessee, the results, it wasn't really implemented well, and there wasn't a lot of change. The county I worked in had a fantastic superintendent who actually went on and became the assistant director of schools for the whole state. The CEO, Vicki Kirk, she was amazing. And we actually saw huge, huge growth in our test scores, in some cases doubling. With those new standards and then teaching things that we implemented. We had a university-based program, which is the program I eventually went back and got my PhD in. First got my EDS, a reading program to help students read better. We saw really fantastic results. There were also increases in math and science and social studies as well because of what was going on. Marmon, nice to meet you. But yeah, so the test expanded in the 1990s. There was also this whole thing about phonics being reintroduced. So phonics were reintroduced. Again, everything in education is slow and it's not even. But the trend towards reintroducing phonics started in the 1970s and the early 1980s. And it really didn't take off most places until the late 1990s to early 2000s. They would teach phonics, but it was a small amount of phonics. And I learned without phonics in 1987 when I started kindergarten. And people give what I'm about to say a bad name. And there might be people on here who just flip their lid when I say this. But because of media attention and people who aren't necessarily educators doing research, and there's a lot of sensationalism regarding reading, people give this a bad name. But in its purest form, it should not be a bad name. And that's the idea of balanced literacy. So the idea of balanced literacy is the idea that you teach both phonics and comprehension strategies, and you have a lot of practice with text as well. Kind of similar to that is the idea of whole language, but whole language was it was less phonics based. Balanced literacy was the idea that ultimately in an ideal world you would have both equally. You would have decoding practice and you would have comprehension and meaning making. Whole language was more, you had a tiny bit of phonics and a lot of comprehension. So somehow that's gotten to mean in this world with, again, sensationalism and lots of people who aren't teachers chiming in and all kinds of things, that's gotten to mean that phonics was not part of that they didn't believe in phonics, and that's totally false. Totally false. Okay, I've worked with the top reading scholars in the world who were part of this movement, and they were very much for phonics. But again, they're also for comprehension, meaning making, doing lots and lots of reading in class, which is a very research-based idea that you need to have lots of interaction with language and with text. Very research-based, but it's also research-based to have phonics. Phonics only covers, by the way, between 60 and 70% of words can be sounded out. So you're not going to get everything that you need, even with decoding, even with sounding out words with phonics. There has to be some memorization involved and some exposure to language. You need to see those words in context so the ones who cannot be decoded, you can understand. And that's another thing that I think has been left out. All right. Thank you for joining. So here we go with 2000s, and that's when things really get juicy. A lot of people blame 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act, and what's going on with our reading problems. There were some good things about No Child Left Behind, believe it or not. It was the first time that there was really accountability for subgroups. So English learners, students with disabilities, before they were just kind of, oh, well, they can't do it, and whatever. There was this idea that those students really didn't count. Now they count. Now they have to test all those students, and they're held very accountable for their progress. Kind of the flip side of that is that testing has taken on a new level. So until 2002, again, most states had some form of standardized testing, but it was kind of up to the states. It may have been a short test. It may have been a long test. There was really wide variation. Starting in 2002, all states have to give tests, grades 3 through 8, in reading and math. Notice I did not say science and social studies, and reading and math. So in many states now, either they don't test science or social studies. A lot of places will test science because, again, the emphasis on STEM, not social studies. That's true here in South Carolina, and I was in shock when I found that out when I went to teach at a school, and there was a child who they were talking about maybe pulling her out during her social studies class, and they said, "Oh, it's not tested," and I about went crazy because I had never seen that before. Everywhere I'd been, they test science and social studies. In Tennessee, they do. Maybe they don't now, but at that time they did. And it's like it's not a thing here. So most schools now only do, if you're lucky in the elementary school level, between 45 and 60 minutes of science or social studies a week. So, and most of the time it alternates. Like 1 week you have science, 1 week you have social studies. That's not enough to do anything, really. So because of that, we're seeing real lack of world knowledge. You see that in disinformation. People will believe crazy stuff because they don't have knowledge about the world. And some people call this a knowledge gap. So the fact that a lot of people don't know about the world now. They don't know basic things about the body, for example, in science. In social studies, you don't know things like the 50 states or how the government works. And I think there is something to be said about that because there's so much misinformation out there. And I don't think that even 20 or 30 years ago there would be that much. We also have the internet, which that helps too. And people have really strong opinions now. Thank you for joining. And so we also have, students, middle school is sometimes a little bit better. Sometimes you have an hour to 2 hours each week of science and social studies. But again, it's not like it used to be where you had blocks. I remember learning the continents in kindergarten, and we did a song. When I taught second graders towards the end of my career, they had no idea what I was talking about when I said a continent because it wasn't there. And there's this idea that it was supposed to be integrated into math and reading, but it really never was. So again, narrowing of the curriculum, that's not really a good thing. Students, the tests are very stressful for students. That's definitely true. And stressful for teachers. That it's led to some policies that are really unfortunate. The one that I could think of the most is, and again, this was not part of No Child Left Behind, but it led to this policy. In about 40 states, students who are in third grade may be retained if they fail the reading test. That sounds like a really good policy. But what it does is it just artificially increases scores because repeating grades, generally speaking, doesn't really help the student because it just is a temporary fix. The student needs intervention with something. They need to learn a particular skill. And they don't learn that just by repeating the grade. And it also really increases the dropout rate. If you repeat a grade, you're 5 to 10 more times more likely. And yeah, that is a big number. 5 to 10 times more likely to drop out. And of course, the students who are affected the most are those students who are working class and poor families who may need to leave or who may need to get out of school to care for elderly family members, sick family members, to work, to support their families. And those are the students who are more likely to drop out. And then those students also are more likely to repeat a grade. So that's really bad policy. And again, somebody may flip their lid. I'm really surprised people aren't talking about this in the comments. Feel free to comment if you want to. And so that happened. Another thing that happened was we stopped writing long text because they weren't required. And again, that's a change. The text used to be really long. Even in the like late 2008 to 2010 in Tennessee, you had to read really long passages. And so teachers would use really long passages, but just about everywhere we've got to these really short passages. And that's because of the way the test is formatted. In most places, again, you have different tests in different states. I don't want to paint a broad brush, but most places they have you just have to read like a paragraph in each case. That also has to do with student focus, which I'm going to get to in a minute. I feel like the tests have gone that way because students are no longer focusing or wanting to read long things. We'll talk about that later. But, so there was this thing, greater accountability. In Tennessee a few years ago, they actually tried to tie licensure, in other words, being able to be a licensed teacher, to test scores. That was defeated. It didn't happen. It was actually put into law, and then they repealed it. And I was actually there the day they repealed it. I've had a lot of stories in Tennessee. Um, but that was a movement for higher accountability. And there's also the school choice movement, which is where, again, money's given either to private schools so that students can attend private schools. And of course, private schools don't can take anyone, and they don't necessarily have test data. The only private schools that have really, really strong test data as like a chain of schools, as a group of schools, are the Catholic schools. They take the NAEP, and they're always higher than the public schools by quite a bit. Catholic schools are good. If you've got a Catholic school in your area and you're interested in that education for your child, go for it. And they usually will work with people of different ethnicities, socioeconomic status. Catholic schools are pretty good. And I've been impressed with the teachers and the principals I worked with for Catholic schools. Very impressed. But most private schools, they are just one school or two schools, and they won't have test data usually. So if you're interested in putting your child in a private school because you think it's better, ask for test data. And you may hear, well, we don't have test data. Or you may hear we only have a little data, or we have data about these ages. There's not a lot of data usually in this school. What there is that, oh, well, this student goes to this college or the student goes to that college, but most private schools have families that have higher incomes, so their students are likely to go to college anyway. So you need to be really careful if you go to private schools. Private schools also don't have to certify teachers. They can have anybody teaching. They can teach anything they want, and that's become a big issue, especially when we talk about science and social studies. Many private schools have religious views, religious backgrounds, so what they teach in those areas may or may not be what is taught in the public schools. So again, if you're looking at private schools, there may be some good private schools, but just because it's private doesn't mean that it's better, and in many ways private schools are worse. So you just really need to look into that. Of course, the homeschooling movement is another movement that's big, and some states are actually giving money to parents now for homeschooling. That opens a big can of worms because, again, there's a huge quality difference. Some homeschool families are fantastic. I have some friends who homeschool, and they do an amazing job, and they do it because they want their kids to have a better education than is possible in a classroom with a whole bunch of kids. Then there are people who homeschool and their kids just sleep all day and they call it school. So again, you have a huge variation. But people always ask me, what's better, private, public, or homeschool? I say, well, it depends on which school we're talking about, because there's really wide variation in all of those school structures. But what public schools do have is they do have data, they have accountability, and they take everyone. Christian, nice to meet you. Phonics was starting to be emphasized. Again, it was introduced in the late 70s, early 80s, but it's starting to be a huge, huge thing. And under No Child Left Behind, there was a program called Reading First where you got money, but it had to be phonics-based programs. Again, a huge push for that. Kind of along with the school reporting, there's teacher blaming, and schools, failing schools, who either get support, sometimes they're even taken over. I saw the other day that Houston schools were actually taken over, and it's been a nightmare. And I shouldn't be surprised about that. I know somebody who taught in Houston, she had some really interesting stories. But for a whole school system that big to be taken over by the state, that's really interesting, because that's a huge, huge change. That many schools, that many kids. I don't know how many kids are in that school system, but probably hundreds of thousands. And to have a school system, at least, and to have a school system that big taken over, that's a huge, huge step. And I don't know a lot about that situation. Maybe if somebody knows about it, they would have chimed in. But New Orleans schools are now entirely privatized, or charter schools. Charter schools are they're technically public schools. They get money, but they're independent. But they do have some measures of accountability. Students usually do take tests. However, the tests don't count the same way. There's a flexibility in teacher certification. The one here, or in Walterboro, which is about 30 minutes away, actually votes teachers not to be certified. They vote like 25% to 30% of their teachers not to be certified because they believe that, for whatever reason, work experience is better than being certified. And to me, that's really, that's kind of a crazy thing to think. I don't think our teacher prep programs are perfect. I've taught in some, But to be a teacher and not have any training at all, to me, that's really dangerous because it takes a lot to teach. You want to go to a doctor and have somebody do surgery who didn't go to medical school. And that's part of this another, which goes along with teacher blaming, there's this idea that teachers aren't professionals and that anybody could be a teacher. That's part of this whole idea of blaming teachers. But anyway, off my soapbox about that. There's a lot of school reporting. There are report cards for school now. Just about every state has some form of a school report card where the school gets a grade between A and F. And based on all these different factors, or like here in South Carolina, it's like satisfactory, very good, good. South Carolina's report card is really vague. It doesn't give a lot of information. Tennessee has a lot of information. And when I looked at something, when I looked at other states, like for when I do videos or something like that, other states up in the Northeast give a lot of information. Like Connecticut, they give a ton of information. So it just depends on the state. But they do have some sort of reporting system in every state. And then, of course, like I talked about, the achievement gap was starting to widen because of all these different things. We also have inequality in the U.S. widening. The poor and the rich, that gap is getting bigger. It's bigger than any other developed country at this moment in time. So, again, till the 1990s, big improvement with the achievement gap between rich and poor students, between students who are English learners and to some extent, student with disabilities. Again, they never really went up as much as other groups, and that's because some of those students have really, really severe needs, and we've never funded special education fully. Depending on the year and depending on the state and all kinds of different things, most students in special education programs get 25 to 30% of the funding that they need. And in some states that do really well, like in the Northeast, is 50%. So even though it's very, very expensive, special education is a very expensive program. For it to work in the way that it needs to work, to get students to where it needs to be, it would need to be really, really expensive. It would need a lot more. And the federal government has not stepped in and done that. And the states have not, for the most part, stepped in and done that. So, all right. After 2010, that's when things start getting really weird, and some people would say we kind of fell out of the ledge. Or you might hear the term, it's a dumpster fire. Things just started getting really crazy after about 2010, 2012. Because a lot happened in this about 15 years. When I started teaching in 2007, I left the classroom in 2016 in the U.S. I went to grad school, and then I went to China, and I saw some really interesting things going on there that were based on things going on in the U.S. Then when I came back here and I taught and I was in higher ed, everything's just changed really, really rapidly. So if you've got kids, hi Beto, if you've got kids in school, the way that they're being taught now and the environment is really different, more than likely than the way that you were taught, or grandkids. Grandkids even more so. It's just really different than it used to be. But in there was Common Core state standards that were introduced in the early 2010s. And again, this is something that's very controversial. A lot of people like to blame that on the decline in reading. And again, I think that's something, it wasn't perfect, and there were some things wrong with it. My big beef with Common Core state standards was at the lower ages, like K through 2, the expectations were really high, and they weren't really developmentally appropriate. Like, they had students reading texts that were really high. They were asking questions and requiring students to do critical thinking that they just weren't ready for. And most states have either revised, they aren't doing Common Core anymore the way that they were doing that, or they have new standards altogether. Because that was just the thing. And the other thing was that there was this idea that you had to do really difficult text. And we've got kids on all different levels. You go in an average third grade class, for example, you will have kids there who are on a kindergarten level in reading. Unfortunately, that shouldn't happen, but it happens. And then you have kids who are 6th, 7th, 8th grade level reading. You just got really big ranges. So the fact that they're saying everybody has to read the same text and the text has to be higher than the grade level, that's just very impractical. And starting with Common Core And there's really always been this. There's a really good documentary about West Virginia in the 1970s and the textbooks. But, the early 2000s was the rise of the Tea Party. For those of you not in the United States, that's a conservative movement, very conservative movement, trying to reform society. There's been some religious movements also trying to reform society, particularly evangelical Christianity. And so there starts to be this idea of ideology and this idea that schools need to have a certain ideology, and many times blaming schools and saying that they don't have those values, for example, Christian values. And again, this isn't totally new. In the 1990s, there was a big thing about evolution. I remember I was sitting in a class, science class, biology class. A girl in the class was a wonderful person. I still think about her today because school wasn't the easiest place for me, and she was always very kind. But her father was an evangelical pastor, and she had a big problem with the evolution unit, which is the idea that life forms, of how life forms. It still happens, the same thing with sex education. In health class, they taught you about the body and what happens to reproduce. There were kids who weren't in that, who went to the library or something. But again, that was pretty mild compared to what happened starting in the 2010s. So since 2010, there's been a lot of book banning. South Carolina's number one. Woohoo! Book reward for book banning. It's about the only thing they're number one in. I don't think very highly of these schools. They're starting to show a little bit of improvement. They haven't had a big reform in 40 years. So, it's just very backwards. It's backwards in other ways, but education, it's just very backwards. So there's a lot of book banning going on. The school district I worked at shortly, well, that's weird. Draw the puzzle piece. Because I'm here, I'm talking. Okay. The school system I worked at for a brief period of time actually is banning a lot of scholarly resources. So there's a database called Discus that's run by the state. Again, I can't imagine anything safer. That's like an encyclopedia, and it's got articles and things in it. And they banned that because they said there was bad stuff in there. They eventually gave it back because the teachers protested in middle and high school, but there's just a lot of book banning. There's this idea that books are dangerous, and that kind of goes along with the phonics, which I'll talk about in a minute, because I feel like that's being used in a similar way, which is not the intent of phonics. Phonics is needed and it's good, but I'm going to explain that. Then, of course, we had rise of technology. So people think that COVID was like the death of education. It started way before then. It started in about 2012, which is when iPhones were introduced. And it's also when most schools started being one-to-one schools. This movement started in the United States. There was money involved from the government and from other places where students would get either tablets or Chromebooks, which are like mini computers. Every student has a technological device. So that's pretty standard now. In almost every school, a student has, at the lower grades, it may be a tablet or it may be a computer from the very beginning. Some kindergarten students have computers. And then, of course, the older students will have computers as well. Just watching the time. But every student has a device to work on, either a tablet or, hi Jorge, or like a Chromebook or a laptop. And we know that this is really bad especially for young students' brains. Students have a lot of stimuli. They're able to get, even with filters, kids are smart in some ways. Even kids who don't necessarily read well or do math well can figure out how to get around a filter, and they'll use those devices to see things that are not good. But there's been this whole thing about technology, and a lot of places don't even have textbooks anymore. Everything's online. A lot of things are gamified, which means that it's like a game. And it's very hard to read full text and make that a game. It is. Again, that's partly because of society. Schools are adapting to society, and society is valuing that, and kids are valuing the idea of not having to pay attention, basically. And parents, they want everything to be fun. They want everything to be instant. And having technology makes that possible. There's starting also to be the rise of AI in schools. And I understand the idea of that it can be individualized. But again, AI is not, it's not, the idea of critical thinking skills is very hard to do with AI. The long passages, the critical thinking skills that you need to solve problems. It's very hard to do that with just, a robot giving a passage or maybe asking some questions or something. That's more like test prep based. So even though it is individualized, which I'm totally on board with individualization. That was why Marcus' career was successful, because I had only a few students I could do what I needed to with them. But the idea that that's going to save education is no, it's not. It's not. And then of course there's concerns about socialization and teamwork and kids having social skills. That's a whole other story. But we know that technology, especially for young kids, is not good for the brain. You can read The Anxious Generation. It's a very interesting book. My daughter is not going to get a cell phone until she's at least in high school, more than likely. But yeah, so there's been this rise of technology, and there's also been, I talked about earlier, privatization of education. There's also commercialization of education. A lot of people have gotten rich off of kids because they have these programs, these box programs that the whole school uses, or in some cases, the whole school district or state uses. And it's more than just textbooks. Like, textbooks used to be the thing that you could get rich off of. But textbooks, the money there compared to the money that's involved with standardized testing, or with these packaged programs, intervention programs, or scripted reading programs, or math programs, it's textbooks are very little money compared to that. It's a lot of money involved. And now Pearson's a big testing company, and it even has schools now that all over the country, virtual schools. So yeah, there's a lot of commercialization of education. These big chains that have schools, there's just a lot of money involved in education. And it's not to the teachers for the most part. Teachers are starting to get higher wages, which is a good thing. They need to, because there is, especially in urban areas, there is a teacher shortage, but the money's not going to teachers for the most part. It's going to these companies. The big money, the money that needs to be spent on kids and on giving teachers what they need and giving them a good wage is being spent on this type of thing. A lot of money in testing as well. So yeah, because of this, we've had a decline in both reading and math scores. And the highest decline, again, is among the lowest students, the students who are struggling the most. So we call this a Matthew effect. So what the Matthew effect is that it's in the Bible, and there's a passage in the Bible, I think it is in Matthew, where it says the rich get richer, the poor gets poorer, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this really big divide where students are either really good at reading, we have some of the highest scores in our advanced group ever, or they're really awful at reading. There's this huge divide. Oh, and another thing that's contributing to that is disability rates. So we have more and more students in special education. Never before. When special education started, it was like 7% of the population. Now it's over 15%. I actually know of one school nearby where it's over a third of the kids have some sort of disability diagnosed. I'm reluctant to say that all those kids have really a disability. I think that's a huge percent. But what they have is they've been found to have a diagnosis based on testing, because there's huge amounts of testing in the schools now. And so a lot of kids are being diagnosed are being qualified. It's not a diagnosis. If you get it from a doctor, it's a diagnosis, and the school can use that to get a child an individualized education plan, or called an IEP. But most of the time, that's not what's going on. Most of the time, the testing's done by a school psychologist, which is another industry in its own. And I know some really wonderful, caring school psychologists. My cousin's a school psychologist, and I worked at a great school psychologist at my last school. Very caring, wanted to really help my students who are both English learners and special education students who were struggling. They have two really big risk factors. But we are seeing higher disability rates. A lot of medical advances have made things that used to cause stillbirths or death after birth. They aren't causing that anymore. And sometimes those are even really mild things that they wouldn't, a long time ago, would have been a big deal. There's a rise in autism. People can argue all day about the cause, but it's likely a variety of causes. And I believe that most of it's diagnosis, that's just it's being diagnosed more. And some parents even want their kids to be diagnosed because they want their kids to have the special accommodations and the special help that having an IEP brings. We're also seeing hi Richard. We're also seeing a rise in children with emotional behavior disabilities, and that kind of goes along with technology. A lot of mental health problems among students, and that can be you can get an IEP for that, for having a mental health problem, and mental health problems are very much on the rise. So there's all these different things going on. So I'm almost done. Thank you for you guys who have stayed and listened. And again, if you have questions, just please put them in the comments. I feel like at some point in the near future, my daughter's going to wake up and I'm going to need to get off. But I'm almost to the end of this. So that leads me to the science of reading. So I'm going to be careful how I phrase this. There are 5 elements, 5 pillars, or you can call them pillars, you can call them elements of reading. Decoding is one. That's what most people think of as phonics. There's phonemic awareness. There's vocabulary. There's fluency, which means being able to read without getting tired and for long periods of time. And then there's comprehension. Some people have also added, and I think it's a good thing to add, knowledge as a 6th. Of all those things, only phonemic awareness and phonics need to be learned kind of in a way. If you read, you're not going to necessarily pick up phonics. Okay. Phonics needs to be explicitly taught. So that means that you need instruction for it. You can't just give a kid a book and say, here, learn phonics. That doesn't work. Phonemic awareness are things like rhyming. And there's also been a big push towards that. And most students only need about 8 to 12 hours to get that. It's needed for reading. You have to learn it, and you usually learn it at a very young age, preschool, kindergarten. But there are places where kids are doing that every single day up to the 3rd or 4th grade, and no, you don't need that. If the kid has a problem with that, they need it. And so there's no definition to the science of reading. None. And people take it to mean a lot of different things, which is part of the problem. But ultimately what it means is structured and explicit teaching. And explicit teaching is good, even when it comes to things like comprehension. Teaching like a strategy is good, explicitly. You don't just give a kid a book and say, hey, here, read this. However, there has to be a lot of practice with reading. It's just like if a swimmer, have this example on a video. If someone wants to learn how to swim well and go to the Olympics, do you think that person's going to stand outside the pool and just study all the strokes? Maybe learn from a textbook or watch videos about the strokes? No, of course not. You're going to get in the pool, you're going to practice. So the issue with the science of reading that I have and many people have is that there's not enough practice in it. And it's so focused on decoding that these other things just kind of get put away. And there are schools even out there that will not give kids books, or they won't give kids books until a certain age. And that's ridiculous. And that's going to hurt kids. Kids really need to practice reading. And it's fine to have phonics. We need to have phonics, but that needs to be part of it. It needs to also have comprehension. So because of that, and there's also a huge emphasis on grades K through 2. And then, there's this idea that you know how to read. And actually reading is a continuum. Students grow when they're reading every year, and they need to grow every year. So again, there's this idea that you learn to read in 1st or 2nd grade, and then, you can read. And that's not true. And the results show that. So going back to that chart, 8th grade was totally static. It was the exact same scores last time, which is crazy that there wasn't even a 1-point difference. Hi, Rolando. So we're ignoring kids at the upper end, and we're ignoring comprehension and vocabulary is a huge thing also. And again, who suffers from not having vocabulary, from not having comprehension skills? Most of the time, kids whose parents have the resources and who have the education will do things like take them to the library. They'll have books at home. They can buy books if they want to. The kid says, I want to read this book, they'll buy the books. And students who don't have that, who are low socioeconomic status, will they won't have that. In many rural areas, there's not a library nearby, or the library's too far away. And of course, now libraries are banning books too, so you can't always get that. If you have your parents have money, they can just buy the book you want. But you don't have that in many cases if your family's poor. And also, English learners, by definition, need extra practice with vocabulary and with comprehension. And in many places, they're actually mandating that the only intervention, that means the only extra work that you could do, has to be based on decoding. So that leaves a lot of kids behind. And that's, hi Ed, and that's especially true with English learners. Many times those students have learned phonics in their home country, and if it's another alphabet similar to English, Spanish is the biggest one, but there's others, Portuguese, German. They can use that to learn phonics in the United States. So phonics is not as big a deal, but a lot of times those students need comprehension, they need vocabulary, and they need just language, and science of reading is really going against that. Now, some people are going to say, oh, Emily, you're awful. How could you say that? But we have evidence of this, and it just makes sense. Another thing that's going on with science of reading that's kind of related to it is that there's a lot of dyslexia advocacy. And dyslexia is fuzzy also. There's actually a new definition coming out, and I'm really happy it's coming out because it's very clear, and it does include things like word level reading, more than just decoding. It also mentions oral language, which is a huge shift that they're mentioning that. It's not just decoding, they're saying that oral language influences reading ability, which is huge that is being acknowledged. Miguel, so I'm really happy about that. I think that might change things, but because of all this dyslexia advocacy, a lot of the intervention programs, which have also taken off the last few years, you'll see RTI or MTSS. Most schools now are using MTSS. RTI is actually really good when it's done right, response to intervention. That was a big reason when my school system went up, but it's a lot of work to do it right. You have to literally put every kid in either an intervention or enrichment group in the whole school, and everybody has to have a group, including like school nurses, custodians, everybody has to be on board, and it's a huge undertaking. So most schools haven't done it right. They haven't. So most places have MTSS, particularly in the upper grades, multi-tier system of support, which is like where you nominate students who are having problems and you problem solve to try to help them. But it's only a handful of students, and many times they're behavior problems because that's what gets notices in schools. And it's really unfortunate, and it's really sad because in the late, like 2008 to 2016, 17, there was a lot of promise of these intervention programs, and most places they aren't being done well now, if they're being done at all. Here in South Carolina, they're rarely done. Again, they have MTSS, and the committee meets once a month. If you have a student you have a concern with, they'll talk about it and they'll come up with something, but it's usually something very small, and again, a lot of times it's behavior rather than academics because there's so many kids with behavior problems now, and that's what causes frustration for schools and for teachers. So yeah, a lot of programs are scripted. That means that the teacher has to read from a script. They say that's based on research, but there's no way that can reach every kid. Some kids it may reach, but many times those are not tested on kids with disabilities or English learners. Almost never they're tested on English learners, very rarely. So we have all of this. And then we have this lack of reading comprehension and stamina. So that's kind of where we're at now. Again, we have students who are starting to improve, but those are the lowest students, and those are the students who really needed decoding. They just never learned how to read, period, even a little bit. And those students are improving, and that's a very big deal. I don't want to underestimate that because that's huge. Hi, Rosa. But we've got all these other things going on. So I'm just going to stay a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions? You put the questions in the comments. Oh, yeah, if you want to send gifts, you can to thank me. That's very kind. No questions. I got to get off of here in a little bit to get ready for my tutoring. No questions? Well, thank you all so much for joining me. That was over an hour. I didn't know I was going to be able to do that. I'm going to try to be on here when I can, and it probably won't be as long or as formal starting soon. This is kind of my test run, and I think it went pretty well. My daughter usually takes naps around this time, but it just really varies. Sometimes her naps are really late. Sometimes she skips naps. So I'm going to try to get on in the afternoon some between about the hours of 2 and 5, but I can't guarantee the exact time. I am starting to do some more work from home, and I'm probably at some point going to put her in part-time daycare. And during that time, I might have more of a structure. I can be the same time every day. But right now, I'm just when I can in the afternoons and sometimes also late in the evenings. But thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And if you're in the United States or you're an American somewhere else, thank you for, or not thank you, happy Juneteenth. It's my mother's birthday too. She was born on June 19th is the day that the slaves were freed, or that the slaves found out they were free. They were actually freed in April of 1864, I believe. But the slaves, they found out they were free on Juneteenth. So it's now a national holiday in the United States. So everyone have a wonderful weekend. And again, if you don't follow me, please follow me. If you found this interesting, please share it with your friends or ask them to follow. And it was wonderful talking to everyone. Thank you so much.